Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Brittany Schotsch, and today I'm going to be talking about understanding intuitive theories of climate change. So to start it off, climate change is a pressing issue in today's society. The most recent climate reports estimate that we have only about 7 years left to dramatically reduce our carbon dioxide emissions before irreversible damage is done to the world and to human civilization. Although scientists have been warning us about this climate crisis for decades, relatively little has been done to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions. In the US, this may be in part due to poor understanding of climate change among the American public, who have failed to generate meaningful political pressure. Recent polls have indicated that while around 75% of Americans do believe climate change is real, only about half think that they could be personally impacted by its outcomes. Concerningly, there seems to be even less understanding on the causes of climate change. When 270 Americans were asked to explain the basic mechanisms behind climate change, only 3% were able to do so successfully. This lack of understanding, both in the causes and in the effects of climate change, suggests that there might be substantial gaps and possible inaccuracies in Americans' intuitive theories of climate change. So in this case, we think of intuitive theories as sort of mental models of causal relationships within domains, such as physics, the mind, or biology. Sometimes causal relationships are really clear, such as knowing if I pull out that red block, the block on top would fall, but the blue block would not. However, causal relationships aren't always that straightforward. Sometimes people are misinformed or they have gaps in their understanding of how things work. So in order to correct misconceptions and fill these possible gaps in people's understanding, Wiseman and Markman have argued that we should first build understanding of people's current understanding of how things are working, their existing intuitive theories, and then develop interventions that fill the gaps or correct possible misconceptions that they may have. And by doing so, it should motivate attitude and behavior change. So in one example of targeting people's intuitive theories where gaps or misconceptions may lie, Wiseman and Markman noted that many adults have misunderstanding on how bacteria and antibiotics work. So the problem discovered is that many people tend to quit taking antibiotics before the full course of the prescription is completed. And they do it because they report feeling better and assume that that means that the bacteria is gone. So after realizing this issue, Wiseman and Markman developed an educational intervention and corrected the misunderstanding to motivate that attitude and behavior change. In the intervention, they explained how antibiotic resistance occurs when the full treatment is not completed, and how stronger bacteria take longer to be killed off by antibiotics. And people can feel better even with the stronger bacteria still in their system, and feeling better just isn't a good indicator that they're completely healthy. So this intervention was successful, not only in strengthening people's understanding their intuitive theories of how antibiotics work, but it also increased desired behavior, which in this case was compliance to completing the full course of their prescription. So we want to do something like this. We want to apply this use of intuitive theories to look into people's intuitive theory of climate change, and hopefully develop an effective educational intervention to promote climate action. So in order to do this for our study, we have 3 main questions. So first and foremost, we want to know if people have a coherent intuitive theory of climate change. And in order to test this, we will attempt to build a model of how people may be thinking about some events related to climate change. If the participants do show a coherent understanding of these relationships, we want to know how their intuitive theories of climate change might differ across political groups and how they might be changed following an educational intervention. So first, we created a hypothesized mental model of how people might be thinking about several issues related to climate change. The arrows of the model represent causal relationships between events. In this idealized model, it's understood that reducing carbon dioxide will have a preventative effect on ocean acidification and global warming. And global warming causes negative outcomes such as the sea levels to rise, droughts, and extreme weather such as tropical storms. So as I mentioned, these are causal relationships, and causal relationships can be generative or preventative. For example, lessening carbon dioxide emissions should have a preventative effect on global warming, and increasing carbon dioxide emissions should have a causal or a generative effect on the increase of global warming. So the strength of a cause or its causal power is the probability that the cause generates or prevents an effect, and it's a probability between 0 and 1. So after designing this model, we asked 400 US-based participants about the probability of 22 possible future events using A through F in the model. So first, we asked about the likelihood that each event will or will not happen, also known as the simple probability. For example, what's the probability that by the year 2040, the average global temperature has increased by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius? We also asked about the conditional probabilities for each causal relationship. For example, if the average global temperature has increased by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius by the year 2040, what's the probability that hurricanes and other tropical storms have become much more frequent in the US? So first, after asking these questions, we wanted to understand if the probability judgments were informed by a coherent intuitive theory of the domain. So first, we wanted to understand how people's probability judgments were showing understanding of the causal relationships. We created histograms to visualize how participants view the causal relationships between events. In this example on the screen, we're focusing on that causal relationship between reducing carbon dioxide emissions and its effect on global warming. The y-axis represents the number of people reporting a causal strength between the two events, and the x-axis represents the probability of the cause generating or preventing the effect. And then just for the purposes of the plots, we have coded the generative causal strengths as positive and the preventative strengths as negative. So in this graph, we can see that the majority of people understand reducing carbon dioxide emissions has a preventative effect on global warming. So we followed this same procedure for each of the other relationships in the model. And these were the results for all of the causal relationships within that hypothesized mental model. So the first two graphs up top, they show that a clear large majority of people believe that reducing carbon dioxide emissions does prevent ocean acidification and global warming. The three graphs on the bottom show us that most people believe that an increase in global warming generates bad outcomes, such as the sea levels to rise, droughts, and extreme weather. Generally, participants' responses matched with our hypothesized model, and they do indicate that there is some basic understanding of the relationships, although there was a range of causal strengths reported. So in addition to coding the appropriate causal relationships, we also wanted to ask if the probability judgments were coherent. So in other words, do their simple and conditional probability judgments fit together as they should according to the laws of probability? So by using the law of total probability, we tested whether we could predict participants' simple probability judgments for a child node from their conditional probability judgments and the judgments from the parent node. By plugging in their responses to the right side of the equation or to the left side of the equation, we get predicted values for the right or for the left. The similarity of the predicted child node value and the actual observed child node value that the participants gave us will speak to the coherence of their intuitive theories. So we followed this process for each child node within the mental model and visualized the results. So these were our results. The plots show the predicted and observed values. We have the predicted values on the x-axis and the observed values on the y-axis. And the graphs show that overall, the correlations between the observed and predicted values were quite strong, and it suggests that participants' intuitive theories were largely coherent. So after observing that the probability judgments were largely coherent, we were then interested on how they differed across political groups. So in order to do this, we first compared the simple probability judgments from the participants from different political parties. So the y-axis of these graphs represent the estimated probability of an event with responses broken down by political party. So we have Democrats in blue, independents in beige, and Republicans in red. People from all the groups do seem to think similarly about reducing carbon dioxide being unlikely, but Republicans underestimate the probability of global warming more than Democrats do. And they differ the most in the belief of the likelihood of negative events, such as the sea level rise, the drought, and the extreme weather occurring. We can imagine people would be less concerned about mitigating climate change if they underestimate the likelihood of its negative impacts. The next thing we want to do was to visualize the differences between the estimated causal relationships of the events. Now on the y-axis of these graphs, we have the estimated probabilities of the inferred causal strength that connects events. We can see people from all the groups seem to think similarly about reducing carbon dioxide emissions having a preventative effect on global warming. However, we can see from the bottom three graphs that Republicans view warming as less likely to cause bad outcomes. This suggests that although their intuitive theories do share some basic structures, there is a difference in the way Republicans think about the causal relationships compared with Democrats. As political groups, all of the political groups underestimate the probability of global warming, but Republicans especially underestimate that causal strength of global warming producing bad outcomes, which leads them to underestimate the likelihood of the negative outcomes, as we saw in the previous slide. So up until this point, we have been in phase one of this study. And now in the second phase, we introduced that educational intervention to see if participants' intuitive theories would be impacted by the intervention. So the intervention group received a 3-minute long video describing the mechanics of the greenhouse effect. So the intervention was created by Rainey and Clark, and it described how the greenhouse effect works, how it refers to the sun's visible light energy being transformed into the infrared light energy, and how it leaves Earth slowly because it's absorbed by the greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. And then how an increase in the greenhouse gas production means that energy leaves Earth slowly, which causes Earth's temperature to rise, and just that whole greenhouse effect. So the intent of this intervention was to really strengthen participants' understanding of that causal relationship between carbon dioxide emissions and global warming. Interestingly and unfortunately, the intervention did not have an effect on participants' probability judgments. It did, however, have a small effect on climate change policy attitudes. So participants were asked about their views on 8 federal policy questions that regarded things such as encouraging renewable energy and discouraging use of fossil fuels. They were asked questions both before and after the intervention. So this graph shows the effect of the intervention on policy attitudes. The x-axis represents the overall participants, and then the participants broken down by political affiliation. And the y-axis shows the mean difference between participants' pre- and post-intervention attitudes. Although independent and Republican views did not change significantly, there was a small effect, mainly consisting of changed beliefs of Democrats. So to recap the results from our 3 main questions. Overall, participants' intuitive theories of climate change were coherent, and intuitive theories did differ across political groups. Unfortunately, explaining the effects of the greenhouse gas had no effect on participants' probability judgments. We still hope to use this insight into people's intuitive theories of climate change to develop future educational interventions. As evidenced by our study, an important area where gaps and misconceptions in intuitive theories do seem to lie and where more work could be done is in understanding that causal relationship between global warming and its negative impacts. Another potential direction that we could take this would be to incorporate social mechanisms of climate change, such as migration, food supply, and economic costs, and incorporate that into the model. And by tying in these social impacts, it may help to show the effect that climate change is having on people already. As we remember from the beginning, this is crucial since only around half of Americans think that they could be personally impacted by climate change. By targeting this misconception and showing that everyone's already being negatively impacted, we hope to strengthen people's intuitive theories of climate change and motivate people to do their part to end this crisis. Thank you.
Hi, that was a really interesting presentation. I just had a quick question about where you received your sample from, and then maybe how much education they would have had already on climate change.
Yeah, so it was 400. They were all residing in the US. So it was a US-based sample, and probably not that much education. We did do we had one part in our study where we asked them a couple questions about what greenhouse gases are and stuff like that. And it wasn't, they weren't already, it was obvious that there was there was some room to learn.
Okay, so was it not a university sample then?
No, it was a MTurk sample.
Oh, okay, yeah, great, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks. That was a great talk. So 2 comments. One is more just out of curiosity is you're asking people to make probability judgments, but there are known distortions. So I'm just curious about people do tend to have probability distortions. So the way that you report a probability is generally different from the actual probabilities. We just have cognitive distortions when we use those numbers. Do you think that having people rating probabilities on a scale from 0 to 1 was potentially problematic? I think what was great is that you were able to predict people's marginal probabilities from the conditional probabilities. That's great. I'm just wondering if answering with probabilities may have affected your results.
It definitely could have. So it was a scale from 0 to 100 that we were doing. And we have plans to do future studies where we might ask them to give a response multiple times to see if they're giving like the same response every time, or to, you know, take the average of the scores to try to mitigate that. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely could pose an issue.
Yeah, or sometimes doing forced choices can help
Yeah.
get those. The second one is there was just a flagging a paper that was released, I think, late last year, where and just in terms of the intervention, where there were personalized, there was a more personalized intervention where there were targeted ads that were done that highlighted climate issues within the context of Republican values like Christianity, a national security problem under immigration, and that seemed to move the needle a lot more than a blanket intervention. And that was just more of an education. So framing it in a context that made more sense to their particular values seemed to move the needle more than just a blanket education. And that was sort of done in the wild. So I wanted to flag that as something that might be useful for future developments.
Definitely. Thank you. Yeah, I think I might be familiar with that. It's definitely, we plan to like look into that in the future for sure. With this one, we wanted to make sure that people were thinking coherently. It was kind of exploratory, but that's definitely a great potential intervention. Thank you.
Hi, we got a question from the online participant. So the question is, I'm wondering what you think about as an intuitive theory as opposed to learned patterns via explicit misinformation. That is also to say, how do you think about the role of media in these explorations?
Yeah, I think that definitely media would definitely play a role, because I think especially in the differences between the political groups, like people with certain political affiliations definitely tend to stay in one area of media or only believe certain people. And so it can like reinforce misconceptions, which would definitely be negative and reinforce these like misconceptions in their intuitive theories. So potentially, hopefully there might be a way like an intervention that could target that, because that I would think that would be a big contributor to the misconceptions or to the gaps that people do have.
Yeah, I had a small question actually similar to the earlier one here. Is you were always asking about probabilities of like relationships, but another important aspect seemed to be like magnitudes of those effects, right? So, and you could also just disagree on like on how much like this drought thing like happens from this. So like there could be vast differences in what people qualify as an effect. All right. So do you have any comments on the size part of these of these effects in their intuitive models?
Yeah, that's a great point. I was thinking about that, and also about the role of like confidence that confidence plays in these. To people would say, oh, there's this % chance, but like how confident are they in that? Or is it just something they heard or something they really strongly believe? And I definitely think in future studies we should find ways to kind of parse these things out to kind of get the bigger picture of how people are feeling and how confident or certain they feel within these ideas.
Yeah, I have one observation. It seems that the unit of analysis from a methodological point of view and all the work is the individual and individual decision making. And it's arguably the case that, you know, the one group that doesn't really change its opinion that much is the reflection of more of a sociological phenomena where they're really not individual decision makers. They're part of a group and they're sort of higher level, group level thinking going on, and
Right.
sort of kind of compare the two is a little difficult. I don't know how you get around that, or have you thought about that?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that that ties back into possibly trying to frame these issues within the like different groups, like societal values and like within different groups. That might be one way to try to target that. But that, yeah, that definitely is a huge factor that plays into the decision making.
Okay, so that's it for this session. Let's thank all of our speakers again, and thank you guys for coming in person and online.